So what we did last time, we talked about the trig functions. You've seen sine, cosine, and tangent. What's new are the reciprocals. You just need to know how they're paired with the original three functions. One thing on your calculator, you need to make sure your calculator is set to give answers in degrees. I feel like it probably is. I'll have to ignore that for now. The way you can do that, if you go to Document, Settings, and if I look at the settings that are there, I should see something where it says angle. My angle measure is in degrees. Okay, later on we're going to change that to a different method, but right now angles should be measured in degrees. You can always check yourself. You can go to a trig function, and I just pick the sine of 90. If I get back a 1, I know that I'm in degrees. Okay, that's just something that's written there in your book. You can always just check. If you get the sine of 90 as 1, you're in degrees. The default setting should be degrees, okay? But if someone else used your calculator for, pre-cal or another class and it's in radians, you won't know. You'll come on a test and you'll get all the wrong answers, okay? So make sure that you know that you're in degree settings, okay? So if you never change it, you're going to stay in degree mode. You have a note, Malcolm? Okay. Okay, so what we need to do now is solve certain calculations or certain equations with our calculator. So the tangent of 44 equal x over 16. If I want to solve this for x, my strategy is to get x what? I want to solve for x by its what? By itself. What can I do to get x by itself in this first equation? I did it. So what is it I had to do to make x go by itself? Multiply both sides by 16. So here I get my answer is x is equal to 16 times the tangent of 44 degrees. Okay. Now I don't walk around with what that is in my head. I'll go to my calculator and say, what is 16 times? And then you see the word there that says trig. I'm looking for the tangent of 44, 15.45. So you should go to 2 decimal places in all of these. So this is 15.45. Okay, all it is just using your calculator to say, what is 16 times the tangent of 44? So again, that's 16 times trig function, tangent of 44, and that is 15.45. Let me just double check and see if I'm getting some of your calculators. You may have settings. Yeah, so you may have a setting like this where it's trying to give you the exact answer. You know, to get the approximation, all you have to do is what? You do Control Enter instead of Enter. Okay, if it's giving you back, something that looks exact like what you typed in, Control Enter gives you the decimal approximation. So let's look at solving equations for x. Okay, first step is to algebraically get x by itself and then use our calculator to estimate. So how can I get x by itself here? What do I need to do to both sides of the equation? Multiply by, not multiply by 12, multiply by x first. Okay, if I multiply both sides by x, I get x times the sine of 39 equals 12, right? Now what do I do to get the x by itself? Divide by sine of 39. So x is equal to 12 divided by the sine of 39 degrees. Okay? So how do I figure this one out? At this point I go where? To the calculator. So 12 divided by trig function, sine of 39, and that's 19.07. What about the next one? How do I get x by itself? Yeah, multiply both sides by 24, and I get x is equal to what? 24 times the cosecant of 71.7. So I'll go to my calculator. 24 times trig function, cosecant of 71.7, and I get 25.28. So what about the next one? I'm tricking you with an x squared, but how do I get that by itself? Yeah, so x squared is equal to 2 times the cotangent of 14.4. Okay, so if x squared is this, x is going to be the what? The square root of that. So I need to find the square root of the cotangent, 2 times the cotangent of 14.4. So on my calculator, this is going to be the square root of 2 times trig function, cotangent of, what was it, 14.4? And that is 2.79. So in the next one, how do I get x by itself? Yeah, multiply everything by 134. So x is 134 times the secant of 12 degrees. So on the calculator, 134 times trig function, the secant of 12 degrees. That's 136.99. And the last one, what do I do to get x by itself? Yeah, multiply by 4, so x is equal to 4 times the tangent of 90. Anyone working that one, what do you get? Undefined, okay? This is, so if I go to my calculator, 4 times the tangent of 90 is undefined, okay? So if you get something like this, your calculator didn't make a mistake. The tangent of 90 is undefined. So we'll get into reasons why later on, but this one, just trust your calculator. If you put something incorrect and it gives you back an answer like undefined, then undefined is your answer. Okay, this is pretty straightforward, okay? All you have to do is read what trig function is and be able to find that trig function on your calculator to get the approximation. Now the other thing, the other skill we need with our calculator in this section is when I give you an equation like this. Now what's different about solving for x in this one versus the ones we just did? X is the what here? It's the angle. So I'm solving for the angle. Remember when we solved for the exponent, we had to know how to take a what kind of function? We were solving for the exponent. We did this after January, so it should still be there. When we solved for the exponent, what did we have to do? Come on, guys. Well, when we were solving for the exponent, the way to get it by itself, you had to use another kind of function. What did you have to use? Logarithm. The reason we use the logarithm because the logarithm and the exponent were what kind of functions relationship to each other? They were inverse functions, okay? So in order to find the sine, the angle, what I'm going to need is the inverse function, okay? So if there's an inverse function of sine, if I can apply the inverse function, then the inverse, what's the inverse of the sine of x? So what does that give me? Any function and its inverse, when you apply them repetitively, what do you get? We worked with this since about November, okay? When you have a function and then you apply its inverse, what do you get? The function that brought you to school today, you left home and you got to Woodward. The function that takes you home today is the inverse. It will do what? It will take you back where you started. So the inverse sine of the sine of x is x, okay? This is the same as when we did logarithms and exponents. So if I can take the inverse function, the inverse sign, that will let me solve for x. So now what I need to do, I just need to find the inverse sign of 1/2. So what angle, when I take its sign, will give me 1/2? Okay, this is not as hard as logarithms, because what you should be able to do, go to your calculator and say, Trig, you've got the inverse sign right here. Okay, so I need to find the inverse sign of 1/2, and it tells me that that is 30. Okay, so on your calculator, when you are solving for the angle, so if I've got a sine, I'm solving for the angle, then I don't take the sine of x, I've got to take the inverse sine of 1/2. So the inverse sine will let me solve for the angle. Okay, so in each of these, let's work a few problems like this. So this is what we did just a moment ago. If I do the inverse sine of 1/2, I get that x is equal to 30, and those are in degrees. Okay, so that's the one we just did on your calculator. So let's do the next one here. If I want to solve this for the angle theta, okay, what you need to get comfortable doing is, okay, I'm trying to solve for the angle. So the angle is going to be, what function is this? Cosine. What function do you think I would need to solve for its angle? The inverse what? Inverse cosine. So I'm going to solve, so I just need to find the inverse cosine of 0.784. Okay, to solve for the angle, anytime you're solving for the angle, you need the inverse of whatever that function is. So inverse cosine of 0.784. So I'll just go to trig function, inverse cosine, 0.784, and that is 38.37. So that tells me this is 38.37 degrees. Cosine of beta is equal to, cosecant of beta is 81/43. Okay, to solve this for beta, I'm going to need the inverse what? Inverse, come on guys, what function? Inverse cosecant, okay? This is the cosecant. To solve for this angle, I need the inverse cosecant. So inverse cosecant of 81/43. Anytime you're solving for the angle, it's the inverse trig function. So 81/43. So I need to find the inverse cosecant of 81 divided by 43. And that's 32.06. So what about the next one? To solve this for theta, what inverse function will I need? Inverse cotangent. So theta will equal the inverse cotangent of 12/21. So on my calculator, the inverse cotangent, what was it, 12/21? 12 divided by 21, and that is 60.26. Tangent is 44/77. To solve this for the angle, so anytime you solve for the angle, you have to use what function? The inverse function. So what inverse function will I use here? It's the inverse tangent. So the inverse tangent of 44/77. So I need to find the inverse tangent of 44 divided by 77, and that's 29.74 degrees. And then the last one, secant of alpha is 9/4. To solve this for angle alpha, I would need to use what function? What inverse? Inverse secant, okay? So this is just the inverse secant of 9 over 4. So really the inverse function for you guys, it's just what you use when you're solving for the angle. The first half of the class, the angle was there and you just plugged it in your calculator. So you were using sine, cosine, tangent, the original 6 functions. Anytime you solve for the angle, you have to know the inverse function. You have to be able to take the inverse. So the inverse secant of 9/4. So this would be the inverse secant of 9 divided by 4, and that is 63.61 degrees. Okay, so again, this lesson broke neatly in sort of the 2 halves. The first half, you had to solve an expression for x. X was never the angle in any of these, okay? You solved it for x, and then you had to plug in something into your calculator, okay? What we'll be doing tomorrow, we'll be doing word problems that require you to be pretty solid with this, okay? The other part that you need to be solid with is when the unknown variable is the angle itself. Anytime you're solving for an angle, you have to use what kind of function? The inverse function, okay? And on your calculator, every inverse function is there, okay? So you have 6 trig functions and you have 6 inverse functions. Now keep in mind, inverse functions are not the same as reciprocals. Reciprocal is just what it's the reciprocal. So these function sine and cosecant, cosecant, secant, tangent, and cotangent, those are reciprocal functions. When you see something with a -1 here, that's not the reciprocal function, that's the inverse function. Okay, so there's really nothing, you don't have to memorize any formulas for these inverses. You just have to know when you're solving for the angle, whatever equation you're looking at, it's going to require the inverse cotangent to solve for this angle, the inverse cosecant, the inverse cosine, the inverse tangent. Okay? And we look here toward the end. So, big important part, most of you have your TI with you. You really need them with you every day between now and spring break, because everything we're doing in Trig is going to require you to be able to do this on the calculator. It's one thing to see me do it, but you need to be able to comfortably do it with your own calculator. So today you should understand the difference between solving for x when x is one of the sides or not an angle versus when x is an angle. So how to use the trig function.